about gender, sexuality, and intersectionality. And I want to thank the fellas for letting me hop on here and be a part of this whole, the Operation Ally. I just think it's great what we're doing and having the conversations. So I know we are now streaming live on Facebook. So if you're there, make sure you're sharing that page as well. And we want to thank you guys for hopping on with us. I'm going to be working with Brittany today and talking about, again, how to be an anti-racist, really focusing on the female gender. It's going to be awesome because, you know, us women are badass. So, isn't that right? Okay. So how many do you think I should get started now?
Yeah, we can go ahead and get started.
Okay. All right. As I mentioned, we are covering, just going over, and it's not really a book review, is we really want to get in touch with how we're feeling about what we're reading, is what I'm gathering from all of our phone calls that we've had about this. But we're going to be covering now the heteropatriarchy, how that plays out in this book and how it affects us, the intersectionality of being a Black female in a racist society and how that intersects. And we're also going to be talking about unadulterated freedom as well. So lots of deep thought going on here. In the heteropatriarchy world, we're going to be covering all levels of how to be anti-racist. So if you're a feminist, you're supporting, if you aren't a feminist, you're supporting the patriarchy. So, you know, you want to make sure you're thinking about women's rights. So you have to be a feminist in that regard. The same way you're either anti-racist or you're racist. From what I gather, there's no in between in there. You're either anti-racist or you're racist. And I know I'm guilty. I know I have floated back and forth, but I think I like to believe deep down, I am an anti-racist for any race. If you aren't a feminist, you also aren't an anti-racist. That's another level. And if you aren't anti-homophobic, you aren't anti-racist. So we're going to be talking about that on all kinds of levels, something that he addressed in the book.
And so first, to speak specifically about heteropatriarchy, one of the things that's important to keep in mind is how intrinsically it intertwines with colonialism. Patriarchy fuels colonialism, and then colonialism fuels patriarchy. And when those two things conjoin, that is when we've seen people's family structures, ideologies, and identities literally changed oftentimes by force because of the influences of those things. And what we know about colonialism and how by force that type of impact was made on people groups, it's something that we want to explore. Has patriarchy seeped into your sense of self? How has heteronormativeness seeped into your sense of self? And in the same way that we check our bias, learning about how much racism has become prevalent throughout our society, we want to do the exact same thing when we're talking about the influences of the heteropatriarchy. Back in 1965, there was a government report from President Johnson's administration that showed a quarter of Black families were headed by women. And this is cited, Kendi cites this as the time in which the nation got a hold of the Black family and basically started to opine on the issues that existed within and opine on the solutions of that. And the media and the government and policies were viewing this fact of a quarter of Black families being headed by women through the lens of patriarchy and sexism, right? Basically, blaming this woman for the reasons why she was the head of household. They would opine that it was because of sexual promiscuity, or, you know, it was because of the welfare system and the cycle of dependency and all of these things, that they propelled judgment towards the single Black mother. And that same patriarchy and sexism is what propelled specifically the eldest son through the aisles of adultification. I mean, Kendi mentions boys who were as young as 10 and 12 years old now being viewed as the head of household, because how dare there be a woman head of household? And this was something that he cites as being internalized in such a way that even the single mothers themselves were the ones that were starting to call their sons the head of household. And we've talked about in previous weeks all of the harm that adultification of young Black boys and girls causes. So this just shows the way that this propels that further. We've discussed quite a bit throughout the weeks the impact of the religious undertones that exist in American society. And oftentimes heteropatriarchy is in the name of religion, right? If we're talking about the missionary system and a lot of the motivation behind colonial acts, it was oftentimes in the name of religion. And when I think about the role that religion has in identity formation, right? Whatever you're told your religion says about you, you almost immediately internalize because you're being taught that that's coming straight from God, right? So if God says that women are supposed to be submissive, you internalize that at a very, very young age. If God says that there's a reason to be homophobic, you internalize that at a very, very young age. There are other lines of theology that could have and should be preventing the impact of patriarchy and homophobia no longer being conjoined with religious thought. I am a loving follower of Christ, and the only thing that he instructs me to do for women towards LGBTQ community is to love them. One of the favorite quotes of mine is that if my religion begins to ask me to choose between loving my neighbor or loving my religion, I will always love my neighbor, because Jesus never told us to love our religion. And that's what made me just adore this painting that I found from a Sri Lankan artist. Just the concept of how Jesus should be a source of liberation, but too often historically we've seen religion used as a tool of oppression. So we've got to keep that in mind when we're trying to unpack how patriarchy, sexism, and homophobia has been entrenched in our society and perhaps even entrenched in ourselves. What we've seen explained previously also is that there is always a way for science to try to explain the science, yes, Fred, science, to try to explain the accusations of a sexist, racist, patriarchal, or homophobic society. And the term homosexuality was actually first coined by a scientist who claimed that it was a biological abnormality. This was the same scientists that claimed that criminality was a biological abnormality that existed in Black individuals. So we need to recognize the lens in which this particular scientist was viewing communities and using his profession as a tool of racism, sexism, and oppression. We've got to consider how can we use our professions as a tool to reverse those. Biological claims, the last one is the theory of hypersexuality being a biological existent in Black people and in queer people. We've seen this prevail throughout history, where whether it's talking about the way that the government or society responds to the AIDS epidemic, or the way that the judicial system responds to rape victims and rapists, the theory of Black women being hypersexual, the theory of Black men being hypersexual, and the theory of queer people being hypersexual impacts how we act in each of those ways. Impacts not how we act, hopefully not how we act, but certainly how society acts. And then lastly, the way that patriarchy impacts gender racism. It's developed this idea that the pinnacle of women was a weak white woman, and that Kendi gives us this spectrum of the white woman being the ideal. And we've got to think about the way, again, media portrayal and judicial system impacts is something that just rang in my ears as I was reading about this. How we view Kavanaugh and Trump and the accusations that have been made towards both of them, and how we view Bill Cosby and R. Kelly and the accusations that were made towards them. Because we are a group behavior society where we try to attribute the behavior of individuals to that of the society, we've seen how groups start to defend people of their own because they don't want their people to be on the end of the accusations. And then we see the way that some people who have institutional power can actually be elevated further into power despite these accusations, while others who don't have institutional power become a victim of cancel culture, even though both of those groups have some folks that are defending them despite accusations. And then the example of the pinnacle of weak innocence being white women, and how we see that impact actual criminals like Casey Anthony, who was found innocent despite a lot of really compelling evidence. And we've even seen like the adoration that some people developed towards this woman who had a lot of evidence that she murdered her child, but because of the lens that we're looking at her through, she gets treated very differently in the media than had she been a Black man that was being accused of murdering their toddler.
And while I was reading this, because I kind of just jumped into the book last week, as it's been on audio play for the last few days, I was amazed at, and I'm talking from my lens as I read this, how it has affected me. When Kendi starts talking about all the women centuries ago that have been speaking out for women's rights and specifically Black women's liberation, I'm just amazed at these brave women that got up there and said what they said. If in my head, if I think about history, I feel like a Black person couldn't say anything without getting killed or thrown in jail or whatever. I felt like we were hushed and we just had no rights. And if we spoke up, then something horrible would happen. So I was amazed at the courage of these women, and that he mentioned some names that I had never heard. I had obviously heard of Sojourner Truth, but I did not know, and I heard of Ida B. Wells, but I did not know that Anna Julia Cooper was an author back in 1858. And she wrote about women's liberation. And these women were so brave. So I just was amazed at how long this has been going on. And then not just Black women, it's women in general, but for these Black women to be able to stand up, knowing that there was racism on both levels, from a gender side and from a race side, is just amazing to me. And then I started thinking about, as I was reading this, if you go to the next slide, these are the women that I started to hear about as I was growing up. And I felt like I was so in assimilation mode that I didn't know enough about what these women were doing to speak out for Black liberation. I'd obviously heard of Angela Davis and Nikki Giovanni because she is a poet. Alice Walker, if you don't know, she wrote The Color Purple. And I did not know who Audre Lorde was, and she was in education, and she was a Black lesbian, so she was fighting on those fronts. So these are people that I did not know about that have been speaking out for the rights of not only Black people, but also for women. Now, the reason Daniel Patrick Moynihan is on this slide with these amazing women is he's the one that was in Lyndon B. Johnson's administration that actually wrote that story or that article about the Black woman and how 1/4 of the Black families were headed by women. And this is significant to me because I do remember as a young kid growing up and seeing more abuse of Black women. And it was, to me, it felt like I'm really angry with him, because I was like listening to this, I got pissed because he put that out there. And then next thing you know, Black men and Black women are pitted against each other. And I remember growing up, starting to see more abuse, some in my family, some in my friends' families, of the men abusing women. Kendi also talks about in the book where his dad came out of singing in a church, and he walked outside and he saw someone abusing their girlfriend right there, a Black man abusing his girlfriend. He also went to, I'm sorry, drawing a blank. He went to a meeting with his girlfriend before his mom was in his life. And the dad was with his girlfriend at the Black Panther meeting. That's where they were. And his dad's girlfriend said something, and the man literally hauled off, smacked her, and said, "Women do not speak in front. They just sit here and listen. They don't speak." And so his dad, of course, was going to defend him. He got kicked out. But those are the kinds of things that I recall growing up, feeling like, even hearing my mom talk about how these men are thinking they're this and that, and we're not doing that. I was raised by a single mother. My dad was in my life, but she was strong enough to see that she wouldn't take abuse, and that she could handle it on her own. But I do remember growing up and feeling this report that he wrote and feeling it prevalent in my life. So I'm angry with him for putting that out there as if that was something to shine a light on. Why were these men not present? You know, he didn't bring to light that more of them were going to jail, or a lot of them were dying because of healthcare, lack of healthcare. Didn't bring that to light. He just brought it out in a way that it made it seem like the woman was in the wrong for not standing up for the Black race. So I wanted to put that out there. These were some strong women that I now look up to, even more so. And then I'm sort of somewhat ashamed that I did not know more about it, and I did not step up and learn more about it and be a young activist, because I was not a young activist. I was just living my life, assimilating, trying to fit into America, and not paying attention to what was going on in my culture. So that's my take on that.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is something that you would be willing to or want to speak more on, but one of the things that I found especially striking and frightening about the report that came out was them not only not opining on why there were Black men missing in these families' lives, right? Because that would have been admitting some of their error, their prejudice, their bias, you know, but opining on the solution. I think I don't know whether it was in the actual report or whether it was commentary on it, that said like the issue was that Black women were overpowering. Mm-hmm. And, you know, here are some of the solutions for how to do a better job keeping your family together, essentially. Mm-hmm. And so when you combine them making a recommendation like that, plus the societal stigma that was being placed on Black mothers, I mean, how would you find that combines to changing women's willingness to leave when it was a good reason to leave, right? He's talking about people staying in abusive relationships because an abusive father figure in the house was better than no figure in the house. Or is that something that you would be willing to expand on a little bit?
I did see that, that, you know, wasn't in my family, but I did experience just seeing a friend of mine firsthand deal with that, growing up in an abusive household. And, you know, the mom sticking around for as long as she possibly could. There's actually an instance where I do know of that somebody just stayed in a relationship, being degraded, more like a verbal abuse situation, just because of that. And you know, it's hard to think that a woman would feel that way. But I do think that some women on the flip side are like, they're strong, they're going to move, I don't care what you say. But then there's some that are like, okay, I got to stay together because God said, or, you know, or, you know, it's the right thing to do for the Black race. I know that there's that side of it too. And I do have, you know, not my own personal in my life, but I do know of a couple of people whose parents, whose mom didn't get out of a situation. And it ended up just being, it's sad now how the mom is lonely now. And so, yeah, without saying names because I am live on Facebook, but you know, I have seen it. And it's this study or this report that he wrote up, it's, although it came out before I was born, I felt the effects of that. I mean, probably 5 years after that was written, I was born. But as I'm growing up in the 70s, I'm seeing this and I'm feeling this. And it's just, I remember feeling like it's man versus woman in some instances. So it's really, it's there, it's real, and it's unfortunate.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I would say I definitely learned through this reading and through the research was I had to check the way in which I have excluded the LGBTQ community from my idea of social liberation and existing oppression. And actually, I noticed I didn't change the heading on this slide yet, patriarchy, because I was listening to a TED Talk that talked about how it's important when we're talking about the patriarchy to recognize that it's actually the heteropatriarchy, right? How those two things are so intrinsically linked, because the patriarchy isn't just about the male leadership in the household, in the community, in government and all of that, but that it's a heteronormative male leading in all of those spaces, and the ways in which that has impacted laws against LGBTQ communities. So we see here through the 50s and the 60s, homosexuality was illegal in 49 states. And there's so many things, even as homosexuality became legal, there still was all of these other things that they could arrest you for, such as non-gender appropriate clothing. And we know that they would raid gay bars and places where it was known for homosexual, specifically men, to congregate, leading to the Stonewall riots. But out of that came this first group to publicly advocate for equal gay rights and the very first Pride parade. And so it was in this time period that we were first seeing it vocalized that this is an entire population of people that has been oppressed and not spoken up for whatsoever. And now, right, because we've started to see that movement for gay rights, we've had a lot more research done into the harm that both laws against the population, as well as just like the cultural aggression towards LGBTQ population. So here we see, and this also actually is also going to be our first little indication of intersectionality, which Rhonda will take us to after this. But here, let's talk about LGBTQ youth overrepresentation in the criminal justice system. You see this heightened percentage of LGBTQ youth being in the juvenile system, as well as you'll see on the next slide. This one. We know that suicide attempts, depression, rates of anxiety, all of these things are increasingly prevalent in truly all minority populations. Here we're looking at the statistics for LGBTQ. And this graph will even break it down by race, which further highlights the harm that is done when we're assessing the intersectionality. When you are an individual that experiences double discrimination because of your sexuality as well as your race. Later, we'll talk about your race as well as your gender. And then this other graph gives us a lot of hope, right? This is why allyship is so important. Look at the way the suicide attempt rate drops if there is at least one accepting adult in a young LGBTQ youth's life, right? We see a dramatic drop in the suicide attempts. And so this is why allyship matters, right? It is literally a matter of life and death. And I think too often when we talk about oppression, or when we talk about trying to end oppression, people downplay it into thinking that we're talking about people's feelings, right? People are sad because of microaggressions, or people are sad because of hate speech. People are sad because of all of these things. People are actually trying to kill themselves and killing themselves. And I think Kendi cited that the average life expectancy rate for a trans Black individual is 35 years. I don't know if you remember that or if I'm right about that, but I'm pretty sure that's what it said. And so recognizing that all of these ways that trans communities, gay communities, Black communities are impacted because of social determinants of health, because of less access to, education and social programs and all of these things, all of those things add up to literally less life, right? We're not just talking about privilege being the reason why we need to step up and be allies. We're literally talking about protecting life. Intersectionality. Take it away, Rhonda.
Yeah, so all of that, intersectionality is all of those things combined. It's like, for me, I'm looking at myself going, okay, I'm double whammy. I'm a Black female. Now think about if you're a Black female or Latina female, all the racist things that come together here. So intersectionality is about fighting discrimination within discrimination, tackling the inequalities within inequalities, and protecting minorities within minorities. So there's a lot going on there. And I mean, to me, at the end of the day, if it was a perfect world, can't we just all see that we're human? I mean, this sounds so complicated trying to explain it, because we've made it complicated. We are freaking humans. If you strip the skin off, everything on the inside looks the same. We bleed the same. I can donate my kidney to somebody else and they can put it in their body, and if it works, it works. So we're all the same. So that the fact that we even have to go this deep and we're at this point is just, it could be so simple. So you have all those things that we're dealing with. So within intersectionality, you're gonna have things that intersect, right? Like I just said. So early anti-racist and the early feminist movement ignored intersectionality. So they were thinking things were mutually exclusive. But when you put, it's there. You're like I said, double whammy for me. There was a group of Boston women, and I love this story. The Boston women that separated from the National Black Feminist Organization to form the Combahee River Collective. So from my understanding, they were a group of women that wanted to define themselves. Were they the lesbian group that left out of the group? Yeah, so they were the lesbian group that pulled out of that, because they even had to pull away from that group of Black women to, feel accepted. So that's the discrimination within the discrimination that we're talking about here. So you got the queer liberation, anti-racism, and feminists all in that group right there. A lot of intersection going on.
Yeah. And real quick before we move on to the next slide, because I, like you, just loved hearing about the Combahee River Collective, I would encourage you all to do further reading on that, watching the videos of that organization. Because like Kendi said, this was a group of women who were excluded from every movement, right? Like if they were in the feminist movement, the white women didn't really want to talk about Black issues. And then if they were in the, Black Power movement, Black men didn't really want to talk about the intersectionality of women issues. And then neither of those groups were talking about queer liberation. And I wonder if we could unpack a little bit about why we see that happen so often, right? I mean, even when the Black Lives Matter movement takes off, so many people retort with like, well, what about brown lives? Or, you know, we saw Caleb, the little poor, the white boy who was murdered, right? And then there's this whole like, well, can't we care about them? Like, why are you talking about Black lives when there's all of this stuff also? Why do you think we do that? Why do we pit oppressed groups or pit harm against one another?
Well, I know, you know, that's, to me, I don't understand it. I don't know if I can answer that, because I don't see why they can't see the Black Lives Matter movement has come out of the consistent injustices of Black people being killed. So I'm biased to that, I think, because I see it. I worry about my sons on a daily basis. I worry about my husband on a daily basis, but other people don't live that life. The people that come back and retort with, well, why aren't we in an outrage about Connor getting shot? Well, if you look at Connor and Laura, it's awful. It's awful. That thing is awful. The fact that he was massacred like that is absolutely 100% awful. Was his murderer arrested? Yes. What people are seeing is like they're looking at this horrible crime, this murder, and they're thinking, well, he was murdered by a Black man. But yes, that Black man was taken into custody and he was already arrested. With Breonna Taylor, her murderers are still not arrested at this point. And these are supposed to be people that protect us. And Breonna Taylor is only one example of all that has happened, the injustices to Black people. My very own brother, not that he's been killed, but he has gone to jail for absolutely no reason. Been in a car in the backseat, riding with somebody that had paraphernalia in the car he knew nothing about. They took him to jail, not the girl driver, not the white girl driver, not the guy passenger. They blamed him and took him to jail. So I think when people do that, they're trying to justify that is also wrong, but they're not wanting to look at the horrible injustices that have happened for so long. That's my opinion, but I could be biased. I could be biased.
Well, no, I believe you. And for so many reasons, one of which being that Black women are always leading these movements, right? Like we need to come together as a society and listen to and trust Black women because they see and feel things that I think get missed, right? I remember learning about the leaders, the people who started the Black Lives Matters movement. They're women, right? And then juxtaposing that to the influential women in the Black Panther Party and just seeing the way that these strong women are speaking up on behalf of not just their population, but all the other intersections that come underneath that. And seeing that it goes even as far back to the Combahee River Collective was just really, really neat. And then there's Kimberlee Williams.
Oh yeah, you're gonna talk about this. I haven't watched this yet, and somebody actually asked about the TED Talk, and it's Kimberlee Williams, right?
Okay. Well, so there's a couple of different TED Talks, but yes, Kimberlee Williams is one of the TED Talks. All in the follow-up email, send out 3 TED Talks that I watched to kind of support some of this. But yes, Kimberlee Williams Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality. One of the things that she said is that we can't talk about something and we can't solve something if we don't have a term for it. So she termed the word intersectionality, and her motivation for it was this case. It was Emma de Graffenried v. I believe it was General Motors. And basically she filed this lawsuit, de Graffenried filed this lawsuit because she felt she did not get this job because she was a Black woman. And the defense came because, or the case got thrown out And the reason why the case got thrown out was because General Motors hired Black men, mostly working in the plant, and they hired women, but they were white, working mostly in secretarial positions. So the court basically had no way to assess the fact that this was a specific type of intersectional discrimination. So there was no way to offer any remedy for this specific type of discrimination. So she ended up writing Mapping the Margins and has gone on to talk about intersectionality just a ton. She has this TED Talk where she talks about the fact that we need to be able to assess that even if there is evidence that Black men are welcome in this space, and there is evidence that white women are welcome in a specific space, that doesn't necessarily mean that that profession, that group, that whatever is welcoming also to Black women. So speaking of that, double discrimination that you cited, the example that she used, and I would like us all kind of to walk through this, looking at these faces. Check your brain, check your memory, and see if you know anything about Freddie Gray, Eric Gardner, Mike Brown, Tamir Rice. Just go ahead and nod your head or give me a yes, right? I know those names. I know why they matter. Now, Tanisha Anderson, Megan Hawkenday, Ora Rassier, Michelle Krusenex. Anyone familiar with those names? Those are women who were also murdered at the hands of law enforcement in the same time period of the four faces on the other side. So she asked the crowd, why is it that these four Black and African-American men gained national headlines to highlight the racism that they fell to, but we don't even know the names of these women? You talked about Breonna Taylor. So now, right, at least we have her name. Sandra Bland, I'd say, is probably one of the first Black women that really started that Say Her Name movement. But needing to recognize that there is a specific type of discrimination because of the intersectionality of being a part of multiple oppressed groups, needing to be dealt with uniquely. Unadulterated freedom. Rhonda, you want to take this?
Yeah, all oppression is connected. So, whenever there's injustice to any group, it's injustice for everybody. And I don't think, that's when people say all lives matter. I actually flipped my daughter out the other night, by the way. She's like, Mom, does all lives matter? And she's 13 and she's more into it than I was at her age. But she's like, Mom, does all lives matter? And I was like, actually, yes, they do. And she was like, taken aback, because she thought I was against the movement. I'm like, I'm not against the movement. It is the truth. All lives do matter. But right now we are focused over here. Black Lives Matter. But all oppression is connected. And if one group is oppressed, then it's not good for anybody. Unadulterated freedom politics. A theory for Black women is a theory for humanity. So again, it falls into the same. When humanity becomes serious about the freedom of Black women, then humanity becomes serious about the freedom of all people. It's the same concept. Again, in the words of Rodney King, can't we all just get along? Can we all just see each other as human? But until one group is free, none of us are.
Yeah. And I think it was Kimberlee Crenshaw who speaks about the concept of trickle-down social justice, where we hope if we solve oppression for Black men, eventually that will trickle down to Black women, Indigenous folk, other BIPOC individuals. But her claim is that trickle down social justice absolutely does not work. But if we were truly anti-racist, if we were truly anti-oppression, we would, as Kendi also advocates for, seek to pursue and fight for the freedom of Black women, because then that would absolve the oppression of those that are subject to less intersections of discrimination.
Yeah, and I like how he points out it's the policies that
Mm-hmm.
we need to focus on to
Mm-hmm.
change,
Mm-hmm.
to fight, to combat and to racism. So, you know, it's a human thing, but it's the policies that are put in place that are putting these issues out there for people of color and women.
Mm-hmm.
So that's policies, we got to work on those.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is this you or me?
You could take it. This is just stats from that text you see there.
Okay, so vote at comparatively high rates and had higher voting rate than all other groups of men and women during the last 2 presidential elections, but remain underrepresented at every level of federal and state political office. Okay, so women are voting, but we don't have our representation in those places that we're voting for, which is crazy. I mean, we go out to do the work, and then we put people in place to make decisions for us that are not really for us. 60% of Black women are in the workforce, making them one of the 2 racial ethnic groups of women with the highest labor force participation rate, but our earnings lag behind most women's and men's earnings in the US. And Kendi talks about this, saying how Black women have to get like higher degrees to get paid more than women, white women that are, you know, high school diploma or just their bachelor degrees. Over 80% of Black mothers are breadwinners. 16.5% of non-elderly Black women in the United States still lacked coverage as of 2014. So even though we're working, all of us are working and we're making the money, we're still, you know, not covered. Black women of all ages were twice as likely to be imprisoned as white women in 2014. So that's daunting to think about. And Black women, I'm sorry, I can't see the bottom, 18 to 19 or 4 times as likely to be imprisoned as white women. So, you know, we know what it is, and we're calling it out in these stats. I know, because if you're on this call, is probably not a surprise to you, but it is something that we need to change.
Yeah. And we saw some of these stats also in the week that we talked about education, as far as the over policing and punishing of Black girls starting as young as preschool in schools, as far as them being disproportionately suspended, punished more aggressively, graded less favorably. The anecdotal and statistical evidence of this is no longer in doubt.
Right.
Yet people still doubt.
Yeah.
Not sure why. Yes, so now let's go into a little bit of discussion time, or actually we're going to do a lot of discussion time because there's a whole lot to unpack. And then we'll come back to share some of that unpacking. But this is quite a neat graph that I want us all to take some time to look at. Take a moment to consider the privileges that you have, as well as the oppression that you experience. One of the things that I think is interesting to consider, especially when we speak on this scarcity mindset of activism, where we're concerned if we're, you know, just advocating for Black lives, are we going to be forgetting about Indigenous lives? Or, you know, what about women? Or what about disabled folk? Or what about all of these things, right? Rather than recognizing that there are so many different ways in which individuals are oppressed, and lots of ways in which you can be privileged. So take a moment and read through this and see if you can kind of check off where your privilege lies, as well as where your oppression lies, because we are able to see commonality in the oppression that we experience in a a largely patriarchal system. And we're also able on this chart to see the privileges that we have that we should, if we are taking this series and this text to heart, put our anti-racism into action, utilizing our privilege to help absolve the areas of oppression. And honestly, I don't know if you would have something to add to this also, Rhonda, but I'm a part of a group that now starts our meetings with recognizing the privileges with which we come to that meeting, and then basically vowing to utilize those privileges for the reason we are existing in this space, right? And hearing some people cite their privileges, there were some that I didn't recognize as privileges that I held, right? I too often don't think about my age as being a privilege that better enables me to advocate. My able-bodiedness, my education, right? These are some things that, because of my lens, seeing them as the norm, I don't see them as privileges. So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that before we take this to the group?
I feel like I too have been somewhat privileged, just because, to be honest, I feel like I'm at a great place in my life. Like, I mean, do I want more stuff? Yeah, I do. But I feel like I've been able to, you know, get the things that I want, for the most part, get the jobs that I want. And I feel like in that regard, for whatever reason, I've just been able to grab those things. I do think there's times when I haven't felt privileged, but I do think, you know, for example, I was privileged enough to get an email the other day from the school, from my son's high school, saying that if you want to be a part of a educational, like a new group that's putting in more African American studies. And, you know, I normally, I don't think I would have been a part of getting anything like that, but for the first time, I'm trying to add to my plate, and I want to be a part of it. So I put myself on the ballot to be vice chair or whatever. Yeah, co-chair. So I do feel like I do have some privileges. Mm-hmm. Yes. And things aren't all bad for me, but I see the injustices. So
yeah. And it's important, I think, to recognize the both in each of us. So when we go into these discussion topics, we want you to first consider your privileges and your oppression. We can consider how this has been internalized in you and your family. For that, specifically speaking to heteropatriarchy, sexism, homophobia, how do you feel like that's been internalized in you or in your family? How do you see it prevalent in your workplace and communities? And then what steps can you take to undo that? So we'll go ahead and divvy up into breakout sessions. Please stand by. Thomas, are you able to divvy up into the groups, or is that something I should do? I realized I don't know if I've ever actually done breakout groups. And I think, ooh, did I do that?
I saw him talking in the group. Is he there? Why is he not helping you?
He is there. He's doing it. So while he separates us out into groups, start thinking about your answers so that when we come to the group, we all have something to bring forth. We especially want to focus on the steps that you can take to undo. But I don't think we can do those steps until we've fully investigated how it's been internalized. Because like I said, there's some things here that I didn't think I did, right? Maybe this can be a little bit of a confession time, but like I said, I didn't realize how much I had internalized homophobia. And Kendi does this, right? How he owns up. I didn't realize that, or my parents didn't teach me to be a homophobic patriarch, but I became a homophobic patriarch because they didn't teach me to be a feminist. Mm-hmm. And so if you weren't taught to be a feminist, you're probably a patriarch. If you weren't taught to be anti-homophobic, you're probably homophobic. even in ignoring the oppression of the LGBTQ community that comes from a place of homophobia, right? If we're not talking about the harms that are happening, that comes from a place of homophobia. If we're not talking about the ways in which women are still subject to the patriarchy in our churches, in our families, in our community groups, in their underrepresentation in government. Rhonda brought up the underrepresentation of Black women in government. I was hoping we have, is Crystal on tonight? I don't see her. There's a woman, Crystal Jones, who, along with myself, is running for Bonita Unified School District. And I think that when we have groups like this and we're able to amplify the voices of women, of Black women, of people that normally fall underneath that purple line on this intersectionality, those are people who are likely wishing and wanting to amplify the voices of others and end oppression for all. I see Thomas say that breakout rooms are set and ready to go. So enjoy those conversations and bring back your thoughts. We'll see you in a few.